Hey everyone, it's Mary. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to talk to you about 10 Christian romance and or Christian fiction novels that I actually enjoy. Now, I know you're probably like, Christian romance? Yeah, I don't usually read a lot of Christian romance. In fact, I have a whole video that I did when I first did the switch to BookTube that I will link up at the top here somewhere, where I talk about why I don't read a lot of Christian romance. And to really sum it up, you can go into more detail in my video, but to sum it all up is most of the time Christian romance is kind of boring. I like romance that is like dark and gritty and has a lot of like real life issues that the couple has to overcome. And unfortunately, a lot of times in Christian romance, they're not that complicated and it's kind of boring, at least in my opinion. You also have a lot of like Western romance and Amish romance, and I just could care less about it. So that's why I don't read a lot of Christian romance. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some really, really good books out there. So I'm going to go through 10 books that I absolutely love. Keep in mind that not all of these are romance, but I will let you know which ones are considered romance and which ones are not. And I hope you guys will check these out even if you're not a Christian, because I tried to pick ones that were like less preachy than some of the other ones. So we'll see what you think. The first on my list is actually an author, Lynn Austin. She has a trilogy, and I don't know what this trilogy, like what the name of the trilogy is, but it's 3 books that I actually read back when I lived in Virginia, and I loved them. And I think one of the reasons why I loved this series, or this trilogy I should say, so much is because I was moved to Virginia for work. I lived there for about a year and a half, and at the time I was reading the books in the series, which take place during the Civil War and take place predominantly in Virginia during Civil War battles. I fell in love with the book because I felt like I was living it. So, for example, the first book takes place predominantly in Richmond, Virginia, and I was living in Richmond, Virginia. So I remember reading a scene where she would talk about like a certain building, and I would go out on my lunch break at work, and I would be like, that's the building! And it just felt like the story was like happening in real life, and it was so cool to be able to read a book that I was actually like going out on lunch break and walking the streets that they talk about in the book. It was so fun, and I think that's probably why I loved the series so much. But honestly, it's a really, really good series that I think you will enjoy. I keep calling it a series. It's really a trilogy. The first book is called Candle in Darkness, and this one is about Carolyn Fletcher, who is the daughter of a wealthy slave owner from Richmond, and she has been raised to believe that slavery is fine. It's God ordained. There's nothing wrong with slavery. It's just the way of life down here. Well, obviously, in this book takes place when the Civil War is taken off, and the battles are coming to Richmond, and her father is terrified that she will be harmed because the battles are getting closer and closer and closer to Richmond. So he sends her to Philadelphia to live with relatives so that she is safe and that she is out of where these battles will be taking place. Well, her relatives that live in Philadelphia, obviously being in the North, don't quite believe the same as the family in the South. And while she's in the North, she befriends a preacher, and I can't remember what his name was. I think it's like Green. Reverend Green. I think it's Reverend Green. But anyways, while he's there, he starts to teach her about what the Bible really says about slavery. And in the time that she spends with that family, she changes her viewpoint, and she begins to realize that everything I've been taught about slavery is wrong. And it's not right that we are owning people. And so she eventually goes back to Richmond in an effort to help the slaves that her family owns become free and to fight for their rights during the Civil War. There's also a subplot. This is a little bit of a romance. While she's in the North, she meets Charles, and Charles is, when she first meets him, they don't like each other because she believes slavery is right. Charles obviously believes slavery is wrong, so the two of them fight, but then as her viewpoint changes and she grows as a person, you see the two of them fall in love with each other. So at the end of the book, they end up together. So it's a little bit of a romance. And one of the things I really loved about this book, again, is it's such a good insight into Civil War time period and a piece of history, but I love watching her character grow and to see someone so narrow-minded from what she's been raised to believe, and to see her change and grow as a person, to change her viewpoint, to change her standpoint on faith, to have a better understanding of God, and to be able to learn enough to see past all of that and to fall in love with somebody. It's so well written. This is my favorite book of the entire trilogy. The second book is not technically it's kind of got a romantic twist, but it's not really romance. Again, these are more like historical fiction than romance. This one's called Fire by Night, and this one you have Phoebe Bigelow, who is from Western Virginia. Her brothers enlist to fight in the Civil War on the Union side, and she ends up signing up to fight with them. She pretends she's a boy, she goes through all the training, and she gets sent off to the war. While she's there, and obviously undercover as a boy, she befriends like a, what do you call it, a campmate, partner, whatever, a fellow soldier, that the two of them become very close, and she falls in love with him. And obviously, he's a boy who thinks she's a boy. So there's no, like, romantic feelings on his end until during one particular scene of battle where it comes out that she is a female. And they profess that they love each other, but it's not a happy ending, and it's not a romance. It's happy in the sense that Phoebe finds love and family at the end, but it's not a romantic ending because, unfortunately, there's a passing of one of the people in the relationship. I think I just spoiled it, but it's all good. Still a good book, not a romance, but it's a good continuation of the trilogy. But the last book in the trilogy is 100% a romance, and also a really interesting take on it. It's called A Light to My Path, and this last book is absolutely beautiful. It is the story of Grady, who is a former slave, and Kitty. At the beginning of the book, they're both still slaves. You have Kitty, who's a house slave, Grady, who's like a field slave, I guess is the word I'm looking for, but he's like in charge of the slaves in the field. Is there higher level field slaves? I don't know how all this works because I've never studied it as much as I probably should have. But Grady is in love with Kitty. And at the very first part of the book, it's them navigating that relationship when they're both slaves because you have no freedom, right? So she's a house slave. And if you know anything about American slave history, a house slave was unfortunately also used in inappropriate sexual ways by the man of the household usually. And then you've got Grady, who is in love with Kitty. He's trying to protect her. They could be sold and separated at any point. But then about halfway, two-thirds of the way through the book, the slaves are actually freed. And so you start to see their relationship build as freed slaves. So it's kind of like the prior of like relationship while we're slaves and then relationship as freed slaves. So it's a really good piece of American history. Well done. And this last book is like so romantic and so it's a hard story. It's a hard story because it's two people in love that are slaves, but it's a beautiful love story at the end, and I love the way it's wrapped up at the end. And again, these books are great because they're just a good snapshot of Civil War history, and they're not super preachy. They're preachy, but they're not super preachy. So the next one is Francine Rivers. Francine Rivers I've talked about on this channel twice now. I've done book reviews for both Redeeming Love and Bridge to Haven. So if you want to check those out, I will link to the Redeeming Love one up here, but Bridge to Haven is also somewhere on my channel if you go back and look for it. And I really love this. This Redeeming Love is probably the most popular Francine Rivers love story. This is the story of a woman who is a prostitute, and this man one day, because he feels like he's being told by God to save her, he buys her out of prostitution and marries her. So what I love about this book so much is it is a true love story. But the thing that Francine... So this woman, because she's been in prostitution, she has such little self-esteem. She believes she's unworthy. She doesn't think she's worth anything. And the one thing Francine really, really hammers home in this book is that in order to love her husband and to fall in love with this man, she has to fall in love with herself. She has to forgive herself. She has to fall in love with herself. She has to fall in love with God. And then once she does that, she can love someone else. And I love seeing the growth of her character. And at the end, realizing that, like, I do love this man. And so it's a difficult love story, but it's a good love story. And I like Francine Rivers. I love the fact that she doesn't shy away from hard topics. Again, in Christian romance and in Christian fiction, sometimes the hard topics are skipped. But with Francine Rivers, she doesn't do that. She just gets into the nitty gritty, and she even has a few sex scenes in the book. Now, obviously, not like full-on contemporary erotica romance sex scenes. No, they're closed door, but she doesn't shy away from the fact that it's a married couple doing what married couples do in the bedroom. Like, it's not shied away. It's a closed door scene, but it's there. And I'm like, thank you, because we're all adults here, and we know that when you're married, you end up in the bedroom together. Just saying. Third one is actually just an author and a series because everybody knows her, and that is Karen Kingsbury's Baxter series. There's a reason why these are the most popular Christian book series out there. I think this is supposed to be turned into a TV show at some point. The reason why everyone loves this is because it's real life. It's real life. I can't remember the order. It's been a long time since I've read this entire series, and she's got spin-offs and everything else. But like, one book deals with drug addiction, one deals with teenage pregnancy, there's one that deals with death and being a widow after the death of a spouse, there's one that deals with terminal illness, there's one that deals with divorce and falling in love in marriage after going through a really bad divorce. These are topics that unfortunately a lot of Christian churches, books, authors, movies, you name it, any kind of Christian anything, try to pretend doesn't happen. But in the real world, stuff happens. People get divorced. People die. People get sick. It just happens. And I love that Karen just goes for it. And she's like, yes, this happens to everybody, including Christian people. And she includes that in her romances. And that's why they're so good. And that's why so many people love them. So if you haven't checked out the Baxter series, you need to. And the thing about the Baxter series is that they're better if they're read in order, but most of the books can stand alone. So if you just see a Baxter series Karen Kingsbury book, pick it up and give it a try. I think you would actually really enjoy it. Third book I want to talk about is called Isle of Hope by Julie Lessman. This is a second chance romance book. So you have Lacey Carmichael and Jack O'Brien, who fall in love back when they're teenagers. Jack is the pastor's son, and Lacey is just like a girl who goes to the church with him. And they fall in love, but one day Lacey gets into a huge fight with her dad, and he kicks her out of the house, so she leaves town. And, you know, obviously Jack is heartbroken, but they all move on with life. And all of a sudden, many years later, she is going back to try to mend fences with her dad. Her dad's elderly or sick or whatever. I can't remember the storyline. He's dying, basically. So she goes back to try to make amends. And while she's there, she obviously tries to also make amends with Jack. But I think the reason why this book is better than some of the other ones I've read is because there's this whole issue of Lacey trying to overcome the trauma of all the fighting and the bad relationship between her parents, and trying to mend that, and all the emotional things that come along with losing a parent, trying to mend that before they pass, that sort of thing. But also Jack is going through a rough spot because in the time that she's been gone, his dad, who's obviously the pastor, is no longer the pastor because he got caught being a cheater. What's the word I'm looking for? Adultery. He was an adulterer. And he cheated on his wife, and that was a big scandal in church, so his family's embarrassed, his parents are no longer together, and he's angry at his dad, he's angry at God, he doesn't really have faith anymore. So you have the two of them really trying to overcome major trauma in their life, and then also rekindle their relationship. So it's actually way better done than a lot of the other Christian romances I've read. Another one is called The Preacher's Promise. This one is by Piperhughley. And this one is also a Civil War fiction book. So you guys notice the theme here. I love like history, but certain parts of history. So I actually really like Civil War fiction because unfortunately in the United States, we're taught a little bit about, at least where I'm from. I'm not going to talk for all the states, but where I'm from in Indiana, we're given a very brief history of the Civil War, but not anything in depth. So I like to read Civil War fiction so I can learn more about history, especially from a slave's point of view, because we never hear about it. So, at least not where I grew up. Anyway, this book takes place right after the Civil War. You have Amanda Stewart, who has recently graduated from college. She lives in Ohio. She is an African-American woman who was raised in the North, so she was raised free. And her father passes away right after she graduates. So, as she's going through his papers, she realizes her father was trying to help figure out how to start schools in the South to help the newly freed slaves get educated, because obviously when they were slaves, they weren't educated. So she decides to take up her father's mission and to go south to start teaching and starting schools. But when she gets there, she meets Virgil Smithson, who is the mayor of this little town. And this little town's basically made up of freed slaves. And he's like, we don't need no prissy school teacher from up north trying to teach us, because you don't know what it's like. You don't know what it was like to be a slave. You've been free your whole life. You don't know the struggles we've been through. The last thing on earth we need is for some prissy up north school teacher, I can't talk, to try to teach us. And so it's a little bit of like an enemies to lovers type thing, but it was really nice to see them kind of get over their prejudices of each other and to fall in love. And it was also a really cool snapshot of seeing what life must have been like, or at least according to this author, what life was like if you were African American post-Civil War, trying to navigate life as a newly freed slave, because you didn't have an education, you didn't own land, you didn't have the advantages. And even if you were, even the difference between like people who grew up in the North free and people who grew up in the South as slaves, like you're so different from each other and trying to navigate that. So it's a really good book. It really, at least it was to me. I would be interested in hearing from people who know more about like African American history, how accurate this book is to the portrayal of life after the Civil War. I would be really, because it takes place in like the late 1860s, so it's literally right after the war. So anyways, I would be interested. I don't know a lot about Civil War history. If you do, I would be interested in hearing your take on this book and on the Lynn Austin books, because, you know, I never know. I don't know. The next author I'm just going to name, you probably already know her. It's Jeanette Oak. Jeanette Oak has been around forever. Her books came out in the 90s, and both of her main popular series have been either a series of movies or series of books, so you already know them. The first one is When Calls the Heart. That is that big Hallmark series that's been on for years. I don't know if it's still on. I never watched it because I don't get cable, honestly. We don't do some of these cable channels because we're cheap. But I know When Calls the Heart, whatever it is, the Hallmark TV show is one of them. And then she also has the Love Comes Softly series, which was a series of Hallmark movies back in like the early 2000s. And both of those are really popular. Actually, really, really beautiful love stories. And I actually read the books and loved them. So if you have a chance to check these out, do so. If not, then watch the movies and the TV shows, because they're actually pretty accurate and they're not bad. The next one is the Royal Wedding series by Rachel Hawke. And I love this series because if you didn't tell me that it was a Christian romance series, I wouldn't have known. These are clean romance, Christian romance, and it's royalty romance. So you may actually know these because they're Hallmark movies. They're called Once Upon a Prince, A Princess Ever After, How to Catch a Prince, and Royal Christmas Wedding. And I'm pretty sure the first and the last books are Hallmark movies or Netflix movies. They're movies. I know they were turned into movies. What I love about these is that they are just normal contemporary royalty romance. Like if you were reading like, I don't know, a Harlequin book about royalty romance, or you're reading, I don't know, like Google royalty romance. There's a ton of them. It's basically reads like a contemporary romance series about princes and stuff, only without sex scenes. Like literally, if you did not tell me this was Christian romance, I would not know, except for the lack of sex scenes. And they're so good, and I love them so much. So definitely check these out. These are great for anybody who's like, I don't want anything that looks Christian or feels Christian. This is a series to choose because you literally don't even know until, you read about the author or whatever. The ninth book I want to talk about is Can't Buy Me Love by Susan Mae Warren. This book is actually book 2 of a series, but I read this book with no problem. I just jumped right on in and went for it. This is about Ella and Adrian. Ella comes from a really, really complicated family, a lot of trauma, death of a parent. She has a lot of past baggage, and she is a housekeeper, but one entrepreneur. So she's a housekeeper who's trying to start her own business. And then you've got the man in the story who is Adrian. Adrian is the heir to a business. And so he's like the heir to millions, and but he's got this like reputation of being a bad boy, and he's got an attitude, Mr. Moneybags, a real jerk. And so people don't tend to like him very much. Well, one day Ella and Adrian get stuck in an elevator together, and she's like, yeah, I'm up to clean this jerk's office apartment. I don't remember what she's cleaning. I'm up to clean this. This dude's a total jerk. He's such a rich priss, blah, blah, blah. And she has no idea that the guy in the elevator is the guy she's talking about. So he lies to her. And so it's kind of like a fake identity type thing. And obviously they start up a relationship together, and then, so later on, he has to explain that he's the big old jerk that she's been complaining about because he's been lying about his identity. It's actually a really sweet book. I really like this book. Really cute and really interesting to see them kind of learn about each other, because obviously, you know, she doesn't realize who he is, but she thinks he's a jerk, and he's just like, whatever, this girl's a housekeeper, she has nothing to her, she's just a housekeeper. So it's really fun to hear them learn about each other. And book number 10 I want to talk about is called Hurricane Season. This one is by Lauren K Denton. And in this book, you have Betsy and Ty Franklin, who are the owners of a dairy farm in Alabama. And in this book, it starts off with them being in a really rough, rocky patch in their marriage. The two of them have been trying to have a baby of their own for many years. They have been unable to do so. They feel like they're bored. Their life is monotonous. All we do is work our dairy farm. We have no children. We have nothing to live for. And we're bored with each other. And they're just really having a tough spot in their marriage, with a lot of it really dealing with that inability to have children of their own. Well, one day, Betsy's sister Jenna drops off her 2 young daughters at the house and tells her, hey, I got some issues I got to take care of. I'm leaving the girls with you for 2 weeks and I'll be back to get them. But then 2 weeks turn into 3, turn into a month, turn into 2 months, and suddenly her and Ty are now raising her sister's children. And it's really interesting seeing the girls bring in this like life to the farm, and suddenly they're spending time together, and it's really almost like them learning to be parents and dealing with the feelings of raising these children and dealing with the loss of not being able to have our own children, but then also rekindling their marriage. And so it's a really good book, actually. It's very emotional in some parts, and I really loved having a book that's about a married couple, because a lot of times romance is about 2 people that don't know each other meeting each other and falling in love. This is a book where they already love each other, but they're falling out of love and have to relearn to love each other. And so I really love that dynamic of this book. I think it's done really well, and I really enjoyed it. So those are 10 of the Christian romance / Christian fiction novels I actually enjoyed. I would be interested to see, do you have any like what's considered Christian or clean fiction and or romance choices that you think I would also like? There are some really good books out there. I just don't tend to read them as much, so I'm definitely open to more recommendations. If you know really good ones, let me know. I'm definitely willing to check them out. Leave me your recommendations below, and if you have any videos about clean Christian type romance, you know, leave me a link below as well. I'm always looking for new things to add to my TBR. Alright guys, I will see you in the next video. Bye!